Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I have an anatomy lesson to share with you. We're working through this book called Muscles and Bones by Charles Kovacs, and we're up to the lesson on skin. Now, skin covers 2 chapters in this book. On chapter 5, the title is Skin, and on chapter 6, it's the care of skin. So we're using this book as our main spine for our main lesson block in anatomy, but we also have some other resources that we're using. And for this particular lesson, I'm also using the Human Body Atlas, and there is a section on skin that we're going to be referring to that has some content that will be some background information for this lesson that we're going to include in the written portion of our lesson. And we also have this book by Welcome to the Museum. We have this version as well as the junior version, which are very similar. And we're also going to be using this part of the book on skin, again, as more information that we can read as part of our lesson. I'm using the Waldorf main lesson books by A Child's Dream. These measure 9.5 inches by 12 inches, and these are double-sided blank pages that are separated by an onion skin. And I've found that we're using the onion skin quite a bit as part of our written work or illustrated work by either adding an illustration on the onion skin. For this one in particular, I slipped the book underneath the onion skin. That way we could trace it for accuracy for this particular lesson. And then we have other illustrations that are not necessary to be anatomically correct, and so we can be a little bit more imaginative with them. And for this particular lesson, we're going to be tracing our hand and drawing it as accurately as possible, and then adding the content for this lesson. At the moment, I'm hoping that it just takes 1 page, but we may need 2 pages depending on how much additional content we're going to include for this lesson. I'm tracing my left hand on the lower corner of the page, and then I'm using my Lyra Color Pencils, and I'm going through to look for browns and light peachy pink colors, as well as a blue and a green for the veins, which ended up being a little bit too dark. And then I also have my Skin Tones by Lyra Color Pencils as well, and then a few other color pencils. I did end up finding a flesh tone color pencil after I had completed this almost the entire project, and then I come back in with a little bit of that flesh tone, and I feel like it adds enough of a realistic look that it feels like this is truly a self-portrait of our hands. And so my daughter, of course, is doing hers as well. And so she can refer to mine for details, but for the most part, this is a very individual process so that we're really observing our hands. And I've never done a project like this before, and I really encourage you to do it if you've never done this before. It really allows you to pay attention to those details and to flesh tones, which are really hard in some cases to recreate. And it allows you really to see the different colors, the different shades, the different textures that are within your hand. Now, this ended up not just taking 1 page and not just taking 2 pages, but ended up 3 pages and 3 lessons for our lesson on skin. So in trying to choose whether we wanted to do our palm or the back side of our hand, I opted to do the back side of our hand so that we could see the nails, because in our lesson, we were learning about not just skin, but nails, and the idea of our outer skin being the dead layer and our nails also being a dead layer at the very end. And the living part is deep and below underneath the skin. So I wanted to make sure that we had our nails because that was part of the lesson. We end up doing the palm of our hand in another lesson, and that experience was completely different. Now, while at first we're really struggling with this to make it look realistic, trying to get details in, you can see that my veins here are way too dark, so I'm using an eraser in order to lighten them, and it never gets light enough, and so I add more skin tones on top of it, and it takes a little while to get it to a place where I'm happy with it. And same with my daughter, but when we were done with this, we really, really liked this lesson. We really enjoyed drawing our hands. We enjoyed seeing the final result because in all of our illustrations for any previous lesson, nothing has been as true to life as this particular illustration. So it allowed us to see the veins, the skin, the nail, and in the next lesson, our fingerprints, and then the fat, the very small fat deposits, that's more like on the palm of your hand, like underneath your thumb. And then the bones that you can feel through, that I was trying to draw. If you flex your fingers, you can sort of see those bones or tendons and ligaments, and I apologize for not naming them correctly at the moment. We're still learning ourselves, but I wanted to include as many of those details as possible as part of this lesson, because the content of this lesson actually is going to be a bit more broad to include all aspects of the skin. And that's why we ended up needing 3 lessons for these 2 chapters rather than putting everything on this page with this illustration. We end up doing the palm of our hand as well as a close-up of skin. So at this point, I'm trying to add some shadowing for the look of your hand when it's kind of flexed, and it ends up not looking very good at all. It looks a little bit scary, to be honest. And so when my daughter came by and saw the progress, at first she's like, wow, that's really good. Then later she's like, it looks like you have stitches. And she was right. And as I continue to try to fix that, it's going to look worse before it looks better. So for this lesson, we did the reading first in the Charles Kovacs book. Then we reviewed the lesson, and now we are doing the illustration, and then we're going to do the written portion. And while we're doing each step of this lesson, we're actually progressing forward with the next lesson and the next lesson. And when these 2 lessons on skin and care of skin came up, I thought that they were similar enough to be combined into one lesson with one lesson content. And that was not the case. And we found that there was a lot more to discuss when it came to skin, not just as a sense organ, but the delicacy of our hands, the beauty of what our skin provides, our whole body, ended up being quite a lengthy lesson and a moment of deep appreciation for our skin. So at this point, you can see that I'm trying to add shadows, especially between the fingers. And at this point, I'm trying to add shadows along each of those ridges on my hands. And this is where it starts to look like stitches. And it's all looking quite a bit darker. And it almost looks like costume makeup or something for dress up for a movie or something. It's not looking like what I want it to look like. And I'm struggling at this point because I'm thinking if I just lay down some more color, it's going to be better. But what happens a little bit by accident is that I end up wanting to erase those extra lines and the extra color. And through erasing, I actually end up getting highlights. And I think, well, that's a lot more realistic, and getting highlights over shadows might be a little bit easier and makes up for the fact that I kept adding more and more color onto it so that it almost looks like where the knuckles would be. It looks a little bit dirty rather than the wrinkles of the skin on each of those joints. So now I'm adding a little bit more pencil along the nail line and around the fingers as a way to accentuate the fingers and separate it from the color. Now, when you're working with color pencils, you can erase a little bit, but as you can see with the veins that I tried to make, which are a little bit blue and a little bit green, they ended up being too dark, and even when I erased them, they were still too dark for what I should have done. So you can go light, you can always go darker, but if you start light, you can always lay down more color. And thankfully, you can erase quite a bit. And if you can't erase all of it, at least you can erase enough to get highlights. I decided to make it look more three-dimensional by adding shadows along each of the fingers and the thumb. And I didn't use a light source to check whether this would be the appropriate place for shadows. And now I found this medium to dark flesh color pencil, and I'm like, this is perfect. So I went ahead and I added more of that color overtop the entire illustration. And what you don't see off camera is what I did a little bit more of, and that's to erase it, to give it more highlights. And I went across the nails, and then down each finger I added highlights by erasing it. Now, if you were using a different art medium, you could certainly use white in order to highlight, but I found that erasing worked just as well. And so I went ahead and I did that along each finger and a little bit on the back of my hand, and you'll be able to see a little bit more of a close-up a little bit later. So now we're just writing in the content for this lesson, and it's at this point that I realized that there wasn't going to be enough room, since we basically talked only a little bit about the skin in this written portion, and there was far more that I wanted to add for this lesson. And so we're going to be using the onion skin as well as the next page, all for skin, the epidermis, and the dermis. So here's that close-up of the hand, and you can see a little bit more of the highlights, which work much better than low lights for those ridges in the back of your hand. And then adding a little bit more pencil line around the nails really brings that to life. I hope that you enjoyed this look at our Waldorf-inspired main lesson block for anatomy on skin. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video, where you can find more information on the lessons that we're doing, as well as all of the resources that we've used for this main lesson block. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.